The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar. Tonight's topic is very important and timely. It is about the fake clinic chain Human Coalition, and our title is Human Coalition's Anti-Abortion Fake Clinics Are a Public Health Disaster. So first we'll introduce your hosts. We are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. The first voice you're hearing is myself, Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm proud to be a Virginian. And you can find me on Twitter at Erin to the max. And I'll pass it to Pamela to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Erin. I am Pamela Merritt. I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me on Twitter at SharkFu.
All right, so let's take a look at the agenda. We'll introduce Reproaction and this organization bringing this content to you tonight. And then our senior campaign lead, Shireen Shakuri, will bring us through a presentation about understanding Human Coalition's fake clinic chain. And then we'll move to a panel discussion. Tonight, we're very excited and proud to be joined by three amazing panelists. Our first panelist is Huling, Counsel at Campaign for Accountability. Next, we'll have Calla, Hales, who's Director of a Preferred Women's Health Centers. And finally, we'll close out the panel with Amy Littlefield, investigative reporter with Rewire.news. Then we'll move to next steps and Q&A. A few housekeeping matters. If you'd like to tweet along with this presentation, you're encouraged to do so. Just please use the hashtag Reproaction. And secondly, if you have questions for the panelists or any of us, you can put those into the Q&A box and just type those in, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. So a bit about Reproaction. Reproaction is a fierce group leading bold direct action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are deeply proud of our left flank analysis. We are known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issues accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And with that, I'm very proud to introduce Shireen Shakuri, our senior campaign lead with Reproaction. And Shireen is based in New York, and she's on Twitter at Shireen. Shireen, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to present on this topic that I've been tracking for quite a while now. So first off, who is Human Coalition? They are an anti-abortion fake clinic chain or crisis pregnancy center chain that began as an online organization that was dedicated to using business analytics, data tools, and search engine optimization, SEO, to maximize the number of women who found fake clinics online and went there instead of real abortion providers. And their president, Brian Fisher, has openly bragged to groups of conservatives during an event that his group's SEO manipulation enabled them to reach more, quote, abortion-minded women than other fake clinics, and that they had a higher rate of visitors who, as they put it, choose life, or they don't decide to seek abortion services after visiting Human Coalition's clinics. And I just want to flag that for more information about fake clinics and how to activate your communities to fight them, you can check out our webinar from, I think, September 2017, which is called Bye Fake Clinics, Using Direct Action to Target CPCs in Your Community. And that's on our site and our YouTube page. But you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what's Human Coalition's angle? What sets them apart from the pack? When someone goes to search for abortion or related terms on whatever browser they're using, typically Google, they would be directed to results for a fake clinic within 10 miles of their location. And Human Coalition's strategy, as Brian puts it, was the abortion-determined woman will not walk into the pregnancy center voluntarily. They must be outreached to and found and brought into a system of care, as he puts it. The reason is because they don't want to go to a place that won't offer them an abortion. Does that make sense? They want to go to a place that is going to offer them an abortion. And it seems like a bad business plan to offer a service that people do not want and to spend a lot of money targeting search results to them for that unwanted service. But that's exactly what fake clinics do because their product is just unattractive. So they have to trick people into their doors. And once they're in there, Human Coalition uses other tools to continue the deception. And this tactic isn't unheard of in the pro-life movement or in the fake clinic arm of that movement, but Human Coalition was one of the first to use it, and they shopped the tools that they had developed around to other fake clinics around the country until they were told, apparently by executives at Chick-fil-A restaurants, that they needed to start their own fake clinics. So they did. You can move to the next slide. Okay, so when they opened their own fake clinics, they weren't using the name Human Coalition for these locations because that doesn't sound like a very medical establishment. So they were using Cura Women's Care Clinic and Women's Care Clinic. You can see a couple examples of their landing pages there, and you can see they look very medical, doesn't raise any flags where even someone who was aware of crisis pregnancy centers might not even think that this place was not going to offer an abortion. It seems medical enough. It never says anywhere that they do not offer abortion or that they do. It's a very clean landing page. And you can go to the next slide. Okay, so again, what sets them apart? That their strategy is built on experimentation. So along with different SEO manipulations that they would run on Google, which by the way is no longer a strategy a lot of fake clinics can employ as effectively because finally after years, Google has changed its policy, but that's something we can get more into in the Q&A if you'd like. But Human Coalition was running experiments on the actual people that came into their doors. So one that Brian describes is offering gift cards. And what he says is, we pulled out our Goldilocks and Three Bears, and we said we are going to offer 3 different denominations of gift cards, small, medium, and large, and see if by offering them gas money, if it increases her propensity to come in. And so they settled on the medium amount of the gift card allotments that they tested. They decided that 35 was too much to spend on one woman, and 15 wasn't enough to get them in the doors. And it's interesting as an aside that an organization whose budget is over $9 million at last reporting couldn't spring for $35 to help women in difficult circumstances, but there we are. They continue to test this practice, and they describe all of their experiments as lab-driven. So that's a concession that this is running experiments within their doors. And they even said that they have started painting their waiting rooms blue because they learned that it impacts women's emotions and decision making, and they decided that is what compels more women to choose life in their view. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned what sets them apart, but what keeps them in line with the rest of the pro-life movement is pretty blatant sexism and racism. On Brian's podcast that he speaks on just about every week, he regularly peddles really racially insensitive and frankly false talking points about the Black community and abortion. He also has repeated calling abortion a Holocaust and using the term genocide. And in the wake of anti-Semitic violence in Charlottesville, actually, Virginia, a few years ago, Brian doubled down on his use of the term when we criticized its sensitivity towards Jewish people. And you can see this quote in the graphic we created to the left. On Brian's show, he's also suggested that restricting abortion access is morally superior to ending the crisis facing migrants at the border, which would be absolutely repugnant even if we didn't have all the reporting of human rights abuses and deaths regularly occurring down there. And I've mentioned a lot of the racism, but there's also a lot of pretty apparent sexism, not only within the movement, but within these podcast episodes that we've listened to. Brian has made some pretty repugnant quotes chastising feminists, comparing abortion to rape, and just bashing trans identities, marriage equality, and this kind of all lumps into what I view as a deeply embedded Christian supremacy within what they are espousing. The language rings of crusader talk. And this is a lot of information, but I'm laying it all out to make the greater point that fake clinics are not any different from the broader anti-abortion movement. No matter how they try to display a supposedly pro-woman and compassionate branding, the simple truth is that they have more or less an adversarial relationship with the women that are coming into their doors and seeking care, because the idea is converting them to a different mindset and a different decision than what they've made for themselves. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so here is some fun that we had, learning that after some of the pressure that Reproaction put on Human Coalition, we held a rally back in 2017 against one of their fake clinics, and they actually started changing their name. So as I mentioned before, they used a couple different names. The Women's Clinic was their first trial, then they moved to Cura. It probably had been a tactical decision based on some sort of experimentation to figure out a name that seemed more welcoming. They stopped using Cura after we sent out a lot of promotional materials and let people know that Cura was a fake clinic. Also, weirdly enough, their Raleigh, North Carolina clinic was called Curo for a while, and it actually might still be called that, but the Cura name otherwise has completely been dropped as far as we can tell, which is really interesting and positive to know that the pressure was strong enough that people actually learned what these fake clinics were and where they were. Next slide. Okay, last bit from me, though some of our panelists will go into it more. How are they getting these taxpayer dollars? So there's a couple different spots where Human Coalition has lobbied for tax dollars within the past couple legislative cycles. North Carolina is still moving and possibly pending for them to receive tax money. They got $300,000 a year since 2017 to implement programs based on what they call their continuum of care. Now their 2019-2021 budget was quadrupled in the state assembly. And as I said, this is still pending. It was before the governor of North Carolina, it was vetoed. They might still get these couple million dollars, which is coming from temporary assistance for needy families money, also known as welfare, in part for this continuum of care, which is highly Christian-based and questionable as far as who it's actually helping and how. Human Coalition has also lobbied for funds, as far as we can tell, in Arizona. They were set to receive $7.5 million, though it was pretty narrowly defeated in the Arizona Senate. That was going to be a 3-year grant funding, but $7.5 million is quite a lot, even over several years, for an organization that we're not quite sure what they're doing and how they're doing it, and we'll learn more about that later from our panelists. They did successfully receive money from Texas, over $8 million for part of Texas's Alternatives to Abortion program, which also comes from TANF dollars. And as far as we know, the largest part of that grant seems to be part of a hotline. for people to call in and receive some level of pregnancy and anti-abortion counseling. Next slide, please. So as I said, we previously have held actions to call out Human Coalition state clinics. The picture on the left of the screen is from outside the Atlanta clinic. We collaborated with Sister Song at Netroots in 2017, which anyone at Netroots now is having a little bit less of a party because we're not protesting CPC. Yeah, you can see in the top right a snippet of the flyers that we passed out with a lot of this information and more, which you can learn more about on our past webinar on the topic, which I've already plugged. And with that, I will pass it to Erin, I think, who will intro our first panel.
Thank you, Shireen. That was fantastic and information-packed. I want to encourage everyone on the line who has questions for Shireen, feel free to put those into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. Just a quick note, to access our previous webinars, Shireen has said they're available on our YouTube page. You can also find them by navigating to our website to the resources section where we hold recordings of all of our past webinars. So please do check that out. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Alice Huling, who uses she, her pronouns. Alice is counsel at Campaign for Accountability, where she investigates unethical behavior within the anti-choice movement and pursues legal actions to hold bad actors accountable. Alice's work addresses the improper use of taxpayer dollars to fund fraudulent crisis pregnancy centers and challenges national anti-choice advocacy organizations on their illegal and unethical activities. In addition, Alice files numerous Freedom of Information requests and sues government agencies when necessary to gain access to sought-after public records. Before joining Campaign for Accountability, Alice was an associate at Arnold & Porter Case Scholar, LLP, where she worked to help Planned Parenthood maintain its teen pregnancy prevention program grant funding. Alice received her Juris Doctorate from New York University School of Law and received her bachelor's degree from the George Washington University. Alice, we're so excited to have you join us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Oh, and you may still be on mute. Let me just see here. I will unmute you. Alice, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's great. Okay, well, the gang is all here in terms of folks who are taking a close look at Human Coalition and demanding accountability. So let's dive right in. Your discovery is extremely important that you've made of Human Coalition's possible malfeasance with state money in North Carolina. Can you explain your findings and how they show non-compliance with both state and federal constitutional principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you all at Reproaction, we'd taken an interest in Human Coalition, and we'd really gotten interested at them at the national level and sort of looking at what they were doing nationwide. But as a part of that investigation, it became apparent that they were receiving the state money in North Carolina and almost certainly using that state money on various religious activities and expenses, which, as Shireen mentioned in her overview, this sort of Christian messaging and pushing a Christian ideology is just such a part of all of the work that we're seeing Human Coalition do. In fact, they don't even call what they do work, they call it a ministry, right? So it really is very pervasive in what they're doing. So based on that, we put together a complaint that we submitted to Governor Cooper, State Attorney General Stein, and Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services in North Carolina, requesting that they both investigate Human Coalition and actually terminate the state's contract with North Carolina based upon this misuse of state and public funding for these religious purposes. So I'll just talk a little bit about the program and what kind of religious purposes we found that they were using the funding for. The Human Coalition first came into North Carolina only in very, very late 2015 or 2016. Just a year later, they registered their first lobbyists in the state, and miraculously, a month or two after that, they received a $300,000 grant from the state to run what they're calling a continuum of care pilot program. Within the state contract they received, it states that the state funding that they're receiving must be used for non-sectarian purposes only. It's pretty clear that that's not happening. The state contract also requires that this continuum of care pilot program use care coordinators and have trained mentors available for the women receiving Human Coalition services. Looking through the care that Human Coalition and the program that they're putting on, it became very apparent to us that it was extremely religiously based. As a couple of examples here, for the Raleigh clinic that Human Coalition has, we came across a volunteer application for folks who would be volunteering for any number of different positions at the organization, one of which is actually a position as a prayer team advocate. In this volunteer application, for anyone who wanted to volunteer at this clinic, asked a lot of very religious and very personal questions, some of them including whether the volunteer applicant had a personal profession of faith in Jesus Christ. If yes, they were asked to share that profession. It also asked the applicants to provide information about their own local churches and to rate the applicant's own knowledge of what the Bible teaches about abortion. Beyond these just absolutely explicitly religious questions, this application also asked a volunteer applicant whether they had ever known an unwed mother, and asked the applicant to explain the situation in which they'd known an unwed mother, all as a part to ostensibly just be providing some sort of care and assistance to women who are meant to be receiving support through this program of Human Coalition. Legally, Human Coalition should not be assessing potential volunteers based upon their religious beliefs and affiliations. And obviously, a prayer team advocate is not a secular position. It would seem to mean that they are screening their volunteers in order to find specifically Christian volunteers with a particular Christian ideology, which would also then mean that volunteers who, any given woman who went into the Human Coalition clinic in Raleigh might encounter would have this particular ideology and attempt to pass it along to the woman who's walked through Human Coalition's doors. Beyond this, we also found that explicit in the continuum of care program that Human Coalition is running, they were to have trained mentors. When Human Coalition talked about its mentoring program, it calls it actually Christian mentoring. It's identified this Christian mentoring as a vital part of its continuum of care program, connecting clients to churches, and sort of advertising that mentors could even disciple women that are in Human Coalition's program, and help them build a home where Christ is honored. So obviously this is deeply religious language that is being used to describe a program that is an explicit requirement of this state-run program a Human Coalition is supposed to be putting on. From a legal perspective, this has lots, it appears to have lots of different issues related to it. As you all may have some familiarness with, but a federal constitution has an establishment clause which bans the establishment of a religion, and this actually applies to state governments as well as to federal governments. The North Carolina state constitution also has clauses that guarantee protection against discrimination based on religion and other sorts of religious discrimination. And the North Carolina Supreme Court has in fact indicated that any laws, any sort of analysis of the establishment clause in the federal constitution would also apply to the North Carolina state constitution. And generally speaking, public funding cannot be diverted as sort of becoming government aid to actually enable religious indoctrination. And by having their mentors who are supposed to be funded through this state funding that they're receiving being discipling women who are coming into their clinics, that appears to be a pretty blatant attempt to use this government funding to actually indoctrinate women in a certain religious ideology. So we laid that out in the complaint to submit to the various state actors and really call into attention of what this state funding is going towards and the religious and inappropriate nature that this funding is going towards.
Thank you, Alice. That is very important work, and I want to encourage everyone on the line, knowing that Huling Coalition is working to continue to get more state funding from a variety of different states, to please go check out Campaign for Accountability's website to learn more about this important work. And I'm going to ask folks to please put any questions they have for Alice into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. Thank you, Alice. And I'm going to pass it over to Pamela for questions with Calla. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for that, Alice. I'm very proud and happy to introduce Calla Hales. Pronouns are she and her. Calla is an activist and executive director of a preferred women's health center with multiple abortion clinics in the southeastern United States. Her work in activism focuses on clinic harassment, abortion access, and survivorship advocacy. She is currently a board member of Charlotte for Choice. Welcome, Calla.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, our pleasure. So let's go ahead and jump right in. My first question for you is, what interaction do fake clinic staff have with your clinic patients and staff?
So I'm the director of a preferred women's health center, like you said, and we have 4 clinics in the Southeast, 2 of which are in North Carolina and 2 are in Georgia. Each of our clinics has a brick and mortar crisis pregnancy center located within a half a mile of our clinic. While we never receive any official clinical communications or referrals from these fake clinics, we do occasionally find ourselves having to get involved with these CPCs in more political arenas and policy forums such as city council, and in some cases, if one of these anti-choice groups sues the city, which we all know is quite a common tactic that these groups use. Our experiences as a clinic with these CPCs has always been negative, and we really find these tactics deceitful. For example, in our Forest Park location, a Catholic ministry leased out our old office space, which was at the other end of a business park. We moved just a few doors down, and they created a CPC in that space to catch patients that were confused by our address change. In Raleigh, the Ministry Hand of Hope actually purchased a residential home right next to our clinic in hopes of turning it into a crisis pregnancy center, despite already owning a functional location directly across the street that operated as your choice clinic. Mm-hmm. We often find that our patients are getting very confused by these things.
Of course, and thank you for sharing that. My next question is, to the extent that you can share, have your clinicians ever worked with patients who had previously been at a fake clinic? And if so, what were their experiences?
We see a surprisingly large number of patients who were either referred to a crisis pregnancy center from a state office or a county health center, or got duped into an appointment at a fake clinic based on websites and Google views. It's most common for us to see these patients here in Charlotte. In Charlotte, we have 2 local crisis pregnancy centers that actually bring mobile ultrasound units that park near or in front of our clinics. And every day, these volunteers for these clinics will very misleadingly wear scrubs. We've heard several times from our patients that these CPC staff members insinuate that they're actually with us at the clinic and they're performing a pre-check-in and ultrasounds on the bus to catch up or to cut down on appointment time and make their visit shorter. We also regularly hear that patients feel shamed and really guilted by these crisis pregnancy centers. In some cases, I've had patients tell me that they felt really intimidated and cut off in these appointments. It's been as far as having a patient tell me that they were actually shut in a room by themselves in one side of an office while their partner was shut in a different room, and they received different counseling based on faith. And it's when patients come inside for their legitimate appointment after dealing with this, they're rightfully angry, upset, and just generally feel deceived and confused about their healthcare options.
Thank you for sharing that. So one of your constant refrains about anti-abortion extremists is that what they're doing is not counseling. And as somebody who follows you online, you often use the hashtag not counseling. Can you explain what options counseling actually looks like and why fake clinics and protesters are not practicing that?
Absolutely. It is a definite soft spot of mine, the idea of truly counseling a patient. A huge part of the ideas of that reproductive healthcare and reproductive justice are based on is this idea that folks have the right to parent how and whenever they choose to in a safe and stable environment. Options counseling really has to include these ideas, whether a patient is interested in abortion, adoption, surrogacy, contraception, in vitro fertilization, or even having their tubes tied or getting a vasectomy. These are all valid choices that we should be openly providing and sharing educational resources that are based in science and not faith. Harassing and intimidating patients that are seeking abortion care and using religion as a sort for the guilt and shame has zero basis in healthcare, and in all reality, it has no place in our daily lives.
Thank you so much for your work and for your insights here. To our attendees, if you have questions for Calla, please do drop them in the question tab, and we'll get to them when we're done with our final panelist. Calla, hold tight. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to Erin.
Thank you, Calla, and thank you, Pamela. So finally, I am pleased to introduce Amy Littlefield. Amy is an investigative reporter for Rewire.news, where she focuses on the intersection of religious beliefs and healthcare. Previously, Amy worked as a news producer for the award-winning global TV and radio news hour Democracy Now! In New York. Amy has reported for various newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times and the Enterprise in Brockton, Massachusetts, where she won awards for her investigative reporting on nepotism in city government. She's also a recipient of a 2014 I.F. Stone Award from the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute and a 2018 Adelante Fellowship from the International Women's Media Foundation. Amy graduated from Brown University and lives in the Boston area. And welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so first, I just want you to, I'm going to ask you some substantive questions, but you just published a piece today that is a must-read for everyone listening on this webinar. Can you share the title of your piece and where people can find it?
Absolutely. The piece is called "An Anti-Choice Group Misspent $50,000 on Religious Material. North Carolina Wants to Give It $400,000 More." And that was just published this morning at Rewire.news. And it gives an overview of sort of the issues around not just Human Coalition, but other anti-choice fake clinics in North Carolina that are set to receive a record $2.64 million in state funds in the current proposed budget there.
It's really a stunning piece and fantastic reporting. I had multiple times when I was reading it where my jaw dropped like a dummy held by a ventriloquist in your findings. So I want to hone in on Human Coalition and our topic tonight. So this article details Human Coalition's poor execution of its grant and its utter failure to meet basic reporting requirements. For our listeners tonight, could you give more details on what they've failed to do and why this is a bad, unethical, and deeply concerning practice for an organization that's receiving public funding?
Absolutely. So in the 2018 budget year, the North Carolina legislature allocated $300,000 to Human Coalition. As the other panelists discussed, this was supposedly to provide care coordination and medical support to women experiencing crisis pregnancies at their FAPE clinic in Raleigh. And the grant was supposed to be administered by the Carolina Pregnancy Care Fellowship, which is an anti-choice umbrella group in North Carolina, which my reporting out today showed, by the way, had purchased $50,000 of religious material illegally using federal funds that were supposed to be earmarked for maternal health and infant mortality in North Carolina, which is a state that has some of the worst outcomes in the country on those issues. But in any case, this allocation was supposed to be administered by CPCF, a fellow anti-choice group. But what the records show is that every quarterly report was late. And by August of 2018, Carolina Pregnancy Care Fellowship had apparently gotten so fed up with what it called, quote, challenges in working with the Human Coalition headquarters office in Texas, that it actually asked the state to intervene and take over the contract so it no longer had to deal with it. And when I mentioned that to Representative Julie Von Hafen, who's a Democratic member of the legislature in North Carolina, she said, wow, if Carolina Pregnancy Care Fellowship can't even get information from a group they're supposed to be working with, they have the same mission, you know, how did the state think that they were going to get this information? And then what the records show is that the following year, when Human Coalition got another $300,000 in public funding, those issues with incomplete or late reporting continued. And finally, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services concluded in a report that it wrote for lawmakers in April that Human Coalition, quote, has not provided all of the required information for the full and timely completion of this report, and that its model could not be identified as evidence-based or even a best practice. So there's this sort of scathing report from state regulators saying basically that they didn't know what Human Coalition was doing with this money. We know from looking at the reports that one of the things they were doing is providing what they called spiritual support and referring at least one person to faith community, which raises those issues around, you know, use of public funds for religious purposes that Alice mentioned. But what's kind of remarkable here is that it's unclear whether any lawmakers actually saw this report that the state wrote about Human Coalition before they voted to quadruple Human Coalition's public funding for next year. So 3 days after the date on that report is when North Carolina lawmakers voted in favor of quadrupling this funding in a version of the budget. And I spoke to one lawmaker who serves on the committee that was supposed to receive this report, the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Health and Human Services. He said that he didn't even know about it until I told him about it. And, you know, he was pretty concerned because he thought maybe it would have been useful for he and his colleagues to discuss this report before they actually voted on the budget. So I think what emerged in my reporting was a disconnect between the regulators who are supposed to be overseeing these massive quantities of public funds going to these anti-choice organizations, and the lawmakers who are continuing to approve this money despite the concerns that the states expressed about how the groups are using it. And we saw that also with the Carolina Pregnancy Care Fellowship, another anti-choice organization in the state that misspent this $50,000 of federal money. And it turns out that Department of Health and Human Services didn't even inform the legislature after they concluded that that money had been misused.
It's just stunning and mind-boggling that here are the legislators voting to send more money to this organization at the same time with that lack of communication. So Amy, another thing that you're known for in your work is you produced a wealth of reporting on the intrusion of religious-based orgs, and I want to be specific about this, that it's religious-based organizations that use religion as an excuse to refuse to provide comprehensive health care services. Those types of organizations and their intrusion into our hospital system, including our public hospital systems. Well, Human Coalition isn't a hospital, and what parallels do you see between anti-abortion fake clinic groups such as the Human Coalition and the Catholic hospitals you've reported on?
All right, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. So I've reported for the past 3 years at Rewire.news on Catholic hospitals, which make up 1 in 6 acute care hospital beds nationwide. And they look from the outside like any other hospital, similar to these state clinics we're talking about. They look, you would never know looking at them from the outside that your treatment that you would receive inside the facility might be any different because of a religious affiliation. And so, one similarity, so these are hospitals that, despite looking like and operating like any other medical facility, they deny abortion care, they deny contraception, tubal ligations, fertility treatments in many cases on religious grounds. And, when we talk about abortion in this context, we're not just talking about abortion care, we're talking about patients who might be losing pregnancies and be miscarrying, who are, the hospital will refuse to end those pregnancies if the fetus has a heartbeat, in many cases, unless the patient becomes extremely sick first. So one similarity, I think, with fake clinics is that people who rely on these facilities often don't know when they're walking in the door that there's a religious motive there, or that religion is going to dictate how they're treated. So research has shown that 1 in 6 women name a Catholic hospital as their go-to place for reproductive health care, but more than 1/3 of them were unaware the facility was Catholic. So, one researcher who looks at this issue told me she wanted to study patient expectations in Catholic hospitals and just sort of understand what patients knew about Catholic facilities. And the institution denied her the ability to do this research, and they told her it was because they prefer not to make our patients aware of what we don't offer. So I think, similarly with fake clinics, there's an unwillingness to sort of fully disclose their true identity and, embrace their religious identity and let people know about it. And they sort of rely on a kind of deception, because if people knew what was truly going to happen inside these facilities, they might not go there.
Wow. Thank you for summing that up so succinctly. So last year, there was an important Supreme Court decision called Nifla v. Becerra that basically gave anti-abortion fake clinics the green light to continue deceiving and shaming people seeking abortion care through fake clinics and through this deception model that you just outlined. Have you seen this, and how have you seen this play out among patients you've interviewed? And also, if you could answer that question for providers as well.
Oh, sorry, you just could you repeat the question? You cut out.
Okay, thank you. So just my final question is, last year the Supreme Court issued the Nifla v. Becerra decision, which basically gave a green light to anti-abortion fake clinics to continue systematically deceiving and shaming people seeking abortion care. And my question to you is, in your role as a reporter, how have you seen this play out over the past year among patients and providers you've interviewed?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's important to note, I think, that what the Supreme Court struck down in this case was an attempt by California not to address the fact that fake clinics exist, but to address the fact that they pose as medical clinics, and to require them to disclose that California does offer free and low-cost birth control and abortion care, and to require unlicensed centers to disclose that they're not medical facilities, right? And so that attempt was what the Supreme Court had turned down. I'll give you one example of, before this law was passed, I went to Hartford, Connecticut, where the city actually ended up passing their own version of regulation like this. And I saw sort of kind of what Calla described, what the abortion clinics in the city are up against. So in downtown Hartford, there's this brick courtyard with a complex around it. There's 2 facilities facing each other across this courtyard. One of them is called Hartford GYN Center. The other is called Hartford Women's Center. The signs look identical. The font is identical. There's nothing from the outside of these facilities that would make it clear to you that one is an abortion clinic and the other is a crisis pregnancy center that's trying to persuade people to come in there so that they, don't go into the abortion clinic. And In fact, apparently the Crisis Pregnancy Center is so aggressive that they at one point waylaid a payroll representative who was on her way to a meeting in the complex and told her that they could help her and she should come into their center instead. So, you know, I think what's happened under the Trump administration and under the current Supreme Court, and the Nifla v. Becerra case is really just one example, is that we're seeing a vast kind of excursion of religion in public life, and we're seeing the Trump administration and the Supreme Court give a green light to these organizations to advance their narrow religious and political agenda, and prioritizing that over telling the truth to patients about who they are and what they're really trying to do.
Oof, okay, well, I thank you, Amy, and again, I want to encourage everyone to read Amy's reporting that just came out today on rewire.news after we finish up this webinar. Please type in any and all questions you have for Amy, and for that matter, also for Calla and Alice and Shireen in the chat box, and we'll get to them as many as possible of those questions at the end, so thank you for that. And I just want to close up before we move to the panel discussion or the Q&A. I would like to encourage you all, if you have not done so already, to sign up for email alerts at www.reproaction.org. We run these Act and Learn webinars every month. They're free, they're open to the public. They're designed to give you a chance to learn more about important topics, such as the incursion of Human Coalition into state budgets, as we're discussing tonight, also sharing best practices about activism, learning more about reproductive justice. So I want to make sure that you are signed up for our email list, because that way you'll get an invitation every time. We don't want you to miss a thing. Also, we encourage you to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and it's lit, y'all, so join us. And then I want to also encourage you to save the date for next month's webinar. We'll be talking about the linkages between incarceration and reproductive oppression, an incredibly important topic, particularly during this brutal Trump era. That will be taking place on Tuesday, August 27th at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you sign up for our email list, you will get the invitation when a link is available to RSVP. So we look forward to seeing you again in August. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pamela to lead us through Q&A.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'm going to unmute all of our panelists. And we have a ton of questions, so I'm going to do my best to get through as many of them as possible. The first question, going to start with Amy. The question is, what is the best way to determine if a crisis pregnancy center in Arkansas or in any given state is receiving funding from the state? And I know as somebody who's done work in Missouri, that there's a specific tax credit that only anti-abortion faith clinics can apply for, but that might not be the case in every state, correct?
Definitely. That's a great question. And it's not always as easy as you might think. So I want panelists to weigh in about how they've managed to track down that information. So one way to do that is by looking at the 990s if the Crisis Pregnancy Center is a nonprofit, trying to understand their financial picture that way. Another is, these budget documents are supposed to be public. The North Carolina legislature has been negotiating a lot of it behind closed doors, but the budgets themselves, which include the line items for all of these different centers, are public information. So you can comb through the budget and look for crisis pregnancy centers. There's also sneaky ways that that you might not think of that funding might go to these organizations, including like pro-life license plate purchases, which I know we have here in Massachusetts, and I believe North Carolina does as well, where there's an arrangement where public funding goes to crisis pregnancy centers through people who want to buy a license plate that has a pro-life message on it. So those are some ideas. I'd love if other people, Alice might have some ideas too about how to kind of do that detective work.
Yes, Alice?
Yeah, well, we do a lot of, the way we find out is doing a lot of public records requests, which obviously is a little easier if you have some amount of infrastructure set up around doing that, but is actually an option that sort of anyone is entitled to pursue. You don't have to really have a background in it. But that is generally how we are finding a lot of that information. But sometimes some of these organizations might even almost brag about it on their own websites and talk about it if they've managed to receive some sort of funding or be part of a program. So even on their own literature, it might be a resource to look at to find out that information. Obviously, that's not foolproof, though.
Thank you. And of course, if you are going through a state budget, you should also keep an eye out for rerouting of federal TANF funds to anti-abortion fake clinics. And those are funds that are supposed to alleviate hunger, but in states like Missouri and in several other states, they end up getting rerouted to these fake clinics. Moving on to another question. This one is, I'm going to start off with Calla for this question. And the attendee is saying that at a CPC in St. Louis, clients have been told of the attendee have been told by staff doing the ultrasound that that the pregnancy is the fetus is waving at them. They are, under 8 weeks pregnant, but are being led to believe that the pregnancy is further developed than is true. And if you could just speak, I know you spoke to some of the misleading things that that folks have been told by CPCs, but if you could talk specifically about the dating of pregnancy and how that is often used as a tactic.
Yeah, absolutely. This tactic of misleading patients using ultrasounds is something that's very common. We constantly hear from patients that they were told that they were either further along than they expected, specifically needing care that may have been more than what they were prepared to financially handle that day. They've been told that they were too far to receive services in the state. In some cases, I've had patients tell me that the CPC told them they weren't pregnant at all, and that was not the case at all. In all of these instances, it impacted patient care. Either a patient needlessly waited, and in turn, in some cases have waited too long. They waited a couple of weeks thinking that they didn't have to rush for care, and turns out that they're having to spend more than they thought they did. And I think it's really important to note that a lot of these CPCs are based with volunteers, and that does not mean that they are receiving medical grade and science-based ultrasound technology courses. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks are not certified to do any diagnostic testing. So that's something that really needs to be noted, is that a lot of these folks are not even using diagnostic ultrasounds.
And just as a follow-up to that, and thank you for that, as a follow-up to that, one of the things that that we're exploring in Missouri through our infant and maternal mortality campaign is the obvious link of a lack of access to comprehensive health care and the toll that it is taking on specifically on Black women and people who experience pregnancy with a mortality rate that's 4 times the general population. So could you just speak a little bit about what it does to a perception of pregnancy? And I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot, but that the idea that pregnancy is without risk, which is what many people are told, and the realities of folks who are delaying a diagnostic ultrasound.
That is absolutely 1,000% true, and it's something that a lot of folks don't think about. So thank you for bringing this up. A lot of the narratives that are pushed at state clinics, and especially faith-based fake clinics especially, is that pregnancy is quote unquote a blessing, or it is a gift. It's the candy-coated version of what you would see in a Hallmark movie. It is, and that's just not real life. pregnancy comes with it does come with, if it's a wanted pregnancy, it may come with great reward, but it comes with great risk as well. And especially in communities of color and especially in southern states where these maternal mortality rates are just skyrocketing, it's preventing folks from making informed decisions about their own care, and in some cases really creating a possibly fatal situation and taking away that choice from them.
Thank you for that. So our next question is, I'm going to start this one off with Amy, and then everybody can weigh in. But this question is that, actually, I'm going to start this off with Alice, and then everybody can weigh in. But the question is specific about Governor Cooper, who has vetoed the budget with the funding that you've described and discussed. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do folks make sure that that lawmakers are aware of this ability, this way of misusing funds? And because, Amy did mention that many of the people found out about it when she called to talk about it. And then there's that overwhelming feeling in states with a conservative political majority that doesn't matter. Is there anything they can do? So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Amy's reporting on this today was, even for somebody who's been working on the Human Coalition stuff in North Carolina, was eyebrow raising, to say the least, with folks not being aware of some of these funding issues and Human Coalition and misuse of funds issues. But there are a good number of ways to try and help raise awareness. So first and foremost, if you know of an organization, a CPC, that is receiving state funding and is misusing that funding in some way, is providing false information to folks who are coming in, is very religious in its nature, that sort of thing, you can certainly, I think it's most effective really if you can reach out to your state legislators and just make them aware of this. It's not that there aren't folks in North Carolina, obviously, who know what Human Coalition is and what it's doing with the funding that it's getting. And so it's really a question of kind of making the legislators who are voting on continuing to provide that funding to this organization and other similar organizations, sort of holding their feet to the fire and making them look at the numbers and how that funding and our hard-earned taxpayer dollars are being used. Letters to editors and other sort of informational campaigns can also be effective. If you can get something out in a local newspaper or something to that extent, where other folks in the populace might just be educated by reading your letter or reading an op-ed or something of that sort. Or if there's a town hall and it's brought up, then other folks who are there might hear about it and learn something about this organization and have some concerns. And I think in particular with an incident where, similar to what we have at Human Coalition, where this public funding is being so blatantly used to push a particular religious agenda, you have folks who may not consider themselves to be very active or engaged on questions around reproductive health issues or abortion in particular, who maybe want to step away from those issues, but may actually have a visceral reaction to the idea of taxpayer money going to a particular religious messaging, because that just is fundamentally in opposition with the way we're supposed to have separation of church and state in this country. So that also can, I think, be an issue that really speaks to folks in a different way than, unfortunately, sometimes some of the other messaging might not resonate.
Thank you. And we've got just a few more minutes, but Amy, did you want to weigh in as well?
I think that was a good answer. I know that lawmakers' email addresses are public because I've spent the last couple of weeks contacting many members of the North Carolina legislature trying to get comment on this. And the gap in communication is pretty stunning. I mean, one crisis pregnancy center that I talked to wasn't even aware that it was set to receive upwards of $200,000 in the budget, because such is the lack of communication between the legislature and the rest of the world, apparently. So, I think one thing that we've really learned over the last several years with abortion care in particular is that local politics really matters, and that's where a lot of this money is getting distributed and where a lot of these anti-choice bills are getting passed. So pay attention to what's happening in your state legislature.
And that is the perfect note to end on. That is a stunning piece of information that they weren't even aware that they were getting it. Wow. This has been amazing. I would like to thank our panelists, Alice Huling, Calla Hales, and Amy Littlefield. Thank you so much for your knowledge and for sharing your time with us tonight. Thank you to Shireen on our team for the ongoing research and work that you've done on this issue and this topic specifically. And also thank you to my co-pilot, Erin Matson. As she mentioned, you can find us on the web and Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Reproaction. And we hope that everybody has a fantastic rest of their evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks.